I know I really am the one who stands between you and lunch. I'm going to keep it really short, also because I had a little misfunction this morning with my laptop, which is not internet enabled. Google that to find out what that means to a civil servant in Singapore. And, and when I was listening to Mr. Wong speak this morning, he struck a chord with me when he said telling a story about people in which they see themselves is what we very much do in a museum. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to tell you a story about where I come from, or where I've been living for the last decade, and what we do at our museum, and how Singapore, which is perhaps the smallest city-state in Asia, exercises considerable soft power in engaging India. I come from a museum called the Indian Heritage Center. The name might suggest that this might be an initiative of the government of India, but it is not. It is an initiative solely of the government of Singapore with the support of the local Indian community, who stand at about 9.2%. So I hope I, in my sari, stand as a reminder of how dear the Indian diaspora holds its Indian heritage. The Indian Heritage Center was an initiative that was mooted first in the 1980s in a letter to the newspaper, the Straits Times. However, it came into fruition only in 2009. We are a museum that has been longer in gestation than we have been open. We were one of the gifts to the nation of Singapore on its 50th birthday, which was in 2015. So we opened our door just a little over 3 years ago. And what we do at the center is remind visitors of the very long courtship that India has had with Southeast Asia, that we date at least to the 1st century CE, and that perhaps is how far back we can date soft power, going at least between the regions in Asia. So having a museum that had absolutely no collection to call its own, that had even within the national collection, which was, like Nari said, a bulk that was inherited as a result of colonial legacy, that had absolutely no representation of the Indian natives that were living on the island. And therefore, we had a null board to start with. We began collecting for the museum, and today we have an important but small collection of antiquities that demonstrate Southeast Asia's connections with India. We are very clear to say that this is not a journey of Indianization. We say very clearly that Southeast Asia was a developed region that borrowed ideas that appealed, clearly making it so that India was an attractive civilization that was persuading Southeast Asia in some way to adopt ideas of perhaps religion and trade that you find flourishing even today in many parts of Southeast Asia, particularly so, say, in Bali or in Java. From having looked at a whole preface to the Singapore Indian experience in the form of Southeast Asia's Indian heritage, we proceed to establish the roots of Singapore's diverse Indian communities. And when we say Indian, of course, in the museum's context, we're talking about a diaspora that moved there much before partition. Migration began in the 19th century. The first Indians arrived there with Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819. Next year is 200 years of Singapore's founding as a modern nation. And that's when we begin the tracing of migration to Singapore. So we can't really talk about Indian as an identity that is restricted to the political identity that it is today, but we're talking about people who trace their roots to present-day Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and even Nepal, to that matter. And in doing so, we're talking about a very diverse heritage. And what exactly have we achieved in the museum? Very quickly, on an aside, while we were waiting on the sidelines to get on stage, Nauri, the professed museum doctor, midwife, gave us a clean chit. She said, I was at your museum last year and I very much enjoyed it. So, clearly there is some element of something right that we're doing at the museum. So you are listening to something that you should, I hope I persuade you to come and visit at the end of this. At the museum, what do? We connect the diaspora with heritage that they've left behind, that they perhaps traveled with, but is now a very distant memory, because in terms of the diaspora, we are talking about a diaspora that's also different, not just in terms of its linguistic diversity, but that is disparate in its migrant history. There have been many waves of migration to Singapore. There are many who are fourth or fifth generation Singaporean Indians, but there could be alongside them somebody who moved there in the last decade and has recently become Singaporean. How do we then encompass a storyline that appeals to all of these different audiences, yet reminds them successfully of one common thing, of their Indian heritage? So we bring together our collection that is largely composed of acquisitions we made, either through purchase or donations. And when I say donations, they come from the local Indian community, so about 50% of what you might see at our museum comes from them. And we use their objects to tell a story that is not highlighting differences, but is one that is highlighting a commonality of experience, a commonality of history and culture. So at the museum, what we also do is we know fully well who our audience is. We know that while we are free to permanent residents and Singaporeans, we have a huge target market that is tourist. We are situated in the heart of Singapore's Little India Heritage District, which I believe 1 in 4 tourists visits. So, and we are also the only sort of cultural, historical experience that's open 6 days a week. So we automatically become a destination that most tourists visit. And therefore, we knew that we would have to create an experience that would, at the same time, appeal to a local audience that was rooted in its history, and yet to a tourist audience that had absolutely no idea what Singapore's own multicultural journey was, and perhaps in many cases thought Singapore was in China. You know, much of our visitorship is incidentally, while we have a huge footfall of Indians, both of local roots and of Indians who come from India, what is interesting is that a bulk of our visitorship is actually Chinese. They're either local Chinese or they're Chinese from China. And we realized that everything Indian became somehow suddenly very much associated with us. If people wanted to get a sense of what attire was like, what dress or language was like, they were coming to the museum to find out what this was. So in some ways, suddenly, Singapore, which has always been at the crossroads of Southeast Asia, India, and East Asia, seemed to revisit its role of the past. We were now suddenly introducing India and Indian heritage to tourists who might not make their way to South Asia and were just stopping by Singapore for a day on transit visits, etc. So our sort of exercise in planning our exhibition became something that was multi-layered and multi-dimensional in terms of the audiences we were catering to. Now, apart from the collection itself relating to the Indian heritage of the community, we also wanted to relate to the collective memories that the communities were divided by. They didn't know each other's stories. As I was saying earlier, the community there is as diverse as it is in South Asia. So perhaps very much so there had been associational life that was built around their own linguistic or religious groups, and therefore they got divorced from the collective stories that they as one community had gone through, especially in the case of history. So we wanted to create spaces within the museum that would help people understand their common stories through the exercise of collective memory. And as I was saying, we were a museum that started off without a collection to speak of. So we undertook an oral history collection drive, and till date we have over 300 stories that we feature in our galleries that talk about experiences that range from migration to the years of war and the period of influence of the nationalist and sub-ethnic nationalist movements from the subcontinent. Is a very popular gallery, not just with the locals, but also with visiting Indian tourists, because they see, for instance, busts that the Indian government had gifted us, busts of Nehru, Gandhi, Bose, all of whom had immense appeal and influence over the diaspora, and also that war was an experience that was very much trans-regional. Singaporean Indians today have families who left Singapore and came back to India as refugees, because at that time they'd already been divorced from their families in India, and they were going back to India for sort of refuge at that time of war. So these stories evoke a sort of a collective experience, a collective shared experience that they can connect with. And we then sort of, apart from the tourists, we have in the recent years since we opened, have become very popular for visits by state leaders as well. I mean, most recently in June this year, the Prime Minister of India visited the Indian Heritage Center, and one of the key places that he wanted to stop at was the Indian National Army section of the gallery, simply because, of course, you know, we have an immense appeal in terms of the collection that we have in terms of the nationalist collection, because these are not from India. They are collected entirely from INA veterans who live still in Singapore, Malaysia, or at least their descendants still live there. So there is a chord that reminds us of the diaspora's connections with the source community and its politics even today. Yeah, okay, I'm going to wrap up. And lastly, I must say that we offer a space for social cohesion and emotional connection. We are a space that young children come to, and they come to perhaps not knowing their distinctiveness in terms of their neighbor that they're dealing with. We have foreign schools coming at the same time as local schools, and we offer a common space for interaction, and we do so through technology and installations that we've commissioned especially for the experiences that we want to offer in the galleries. And these could be find your hometown sort of installations that are map-based, or gaming experiences in the museum gallery. So these have been quite successful in courting communities. So that was just in a very quick nutshell how we try to use the museum space as a place of soft power. Thank you.